Good morning, my name is Alex Waller. I'm a secondary science teacher, and I did my PhD in the Thai University on environmental ethics and renewable energy. And since then, Professor Mace has asked me to be a visiting professor at the AUSN. So, what I'd like to do today is, I got spurred into a way of thinking, having read a new book that's out this year called Prisoners of Conscience and Circumstance by my friend Terry Morgan. And he is also very interested in a UK-based group, Population Matters, as it was. And in the author's introduction, he says, no one can forecast with any accuracy what the world will be like for young people in 30 years' time. If anything, the story is meant as a warning, and if it touches a nerve and leads to a serious global discussion on the solution of overpopulation, it will have served its purpose. So, I'd like to thank Terry. I'm going to ask Terry to read a little extract later from his book. I don't know, do you know which page? Okay, I'll try and find that. And I'd just like to talk about the idea of the rising population, getting bigger and bigger. And I wanted to introduce a term because I think one of the ways to keep a debate active is to perhaps have something novel about it. So I've introduced this term, preventing the Catastrophian Age. It's a play, perhaps, on the idea of an Anthropocene. You've probably heard the term Anthropocene epoch. Well, epochs are really long periods of time, and an age is a smaller section. I'm not going to read my presentation. It has a slightly different title, but it's in the booklet. And I'd just like to do a bit of a talk, really, rather than present the paper in itself. Everybody's familiar with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. No poverty, zero hunger, social good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, etc., etc., life on land, water, climate change. But there's actually not one specific goal that addresses population. And that seems to me, I know that many of them have an aspect of that, but it seems that it's something that is lacking. In this book, there's a couple of nice little pictures, and one of these is, sorry if you can't see the screen, I'm stood in the way. 1970 to 2017, the human population has increased about 85%, maybe 100%, nearly doubled. Whereas the wildlife population, the global biomass of vertebrates, has gone down by nearly half, 58%. If we go back 10,000 years, I think this is an amazing little graph. I'm not sure how reliable these statistics are. They're from an organisation called Population Matters. But when I looked back to this source, it actually sort of seem to add up. But you can see here, there's about 1% humans, 99% wild animals, whereas now of the vertebrates, it's not including all the insects and the wildlife, 32% is human, and 67% is livestock, 1% wild animals by weight, by mass. And so the idea of population, I wanted to sort of just have a look at a few things. Biodiversity as areas of hotspots, particularly in Africa, bits of Asia where it's covered in protected areas. So there's not necessarily protection on where there's greatest human impact. Carbon dioxide emissions, again very high in the northern hemisphere, not so significant in the lower hemisphere apart from Australia, possibly South Africa. So if we've got this rising average global temperatures, and we've got the rising population, and we've got, of course, the wealthy nations perhaps producing more of that carbon dioxide, where are the greatest economic impacts going to be? Significantly more negative impact in the southern hemisphere than the northern hemisphere. Quite a significant contrast here. These maps are from our World in Data website, which gets them mainly from UN sources. His uncle, an ex-politician and professor of biology, and a man many still consider an extremist for his views on human population control. Prisoners is a hard-hitting, well-researched and controversial short novel. So as we're waiting,
I'm
going to ask Terry, would you mind reading an extract for me? Yeah, I might come to it later. Whilst we're setting up, it might be time efficient. Okay.
Well, as Alex has said, this is a novel. But I truly believe that a lot of serious biological, ethical issues are really a turn-up for most people. They really are. And my attempt here with this book, as with another one, is to really sort of entertain people by reading something which is actually readable, but actually conveys a message. And this book that Alex has picked up of mine is about a professor of biology. He's in prison for a reason which you will find out if you actually read the book. He's in prison, and he's visited by his nephew. We're talking about the year 2050. We're talking about a mega city. There's 10 million people living in it, and social deprivation, unemployment, there are massive social problems in this city. And this young lad who comes to see the professor is really trying to some help. He wants some advice. And the professor, as Alex says, has spent a whole lifetime trying to convince the world that overpopulation is a massive issue, and it really needs to be dealt with proactively, rather than just sitting and saying, oh, there are too many people here. Something needs to be done. And that's what he's been saying for such a long time. And he's in prison for that. I will read the bit that Alex has pointed out here. This is the professor talking to his nephew. Did I already tell you that it took humanity 200,000 years to reach 1 million, with only another 200 years to reach 7 billion? Billion, I should say, not million, billion. Khao, that's his nephew, nodded sadly and spoke for the first time for a while. The numbers went up, uncle, but the quality of life went down. The professor says. It depends how you measure quality, of course, he replied. There are few who would want to return to times when age expectancy was around 35 years. On the other hand, some people achieved an awful lot before dying very young. Vincent van Gogh was 37. Mozart was only 35. John Keats, the poet, died at only 25. He pauses and gave a half smile. Thankfully, scientists last a lot longer. But there's no need to measure, there is a need to measure contentment and fulfillment in life, as you know, Carl. Knowing where all this was headed, the professor took another deep breath. The book is also about the professor's mother who has died, and the reasons for her death are part of the book as well. So, your grandmother, he says. While I talk about the environmental impact of population growth and its sustainability, your grandmother, who was actually a gynecologist who promoted birth control in places like Bangladesh and India and sub-Saharan Africa, Your grandmother talked about quality of life and poverty, but she was getting older, and I was, by then, a politician and finding myself in all sorts of problems for being outspoken. I was dropped from lists of speakers at conferences and conventions. I became the subject of newspaper articles, some suggesting I should be listened to, most saying the complete opposite. That I was a hard, uncompromising individual with no heart and, being childless, had no comprehension of the emotional needs of children. He paused as another thought struck him, and Khao jumped in. Didn't you want children, Uncle? No. It was the first time that they'd come close to mention the professor's wife, Catherine, had been a biochemist. They'd known each other since student days, but married late, in their early 30s. She died of a brain tumour 2 years later. He continued where he left off. It was a hard time during which I lost my parliamentary seat, he said. I managed to retain my status as a scientific advisor to government, but it was a precarious position. I reverted to writing and accepting offers to speak to some of the more enlightened groups, but I became more and more impatient with so little action being taken, and all the time I was leaving an even wider trail of controversy in my wake. He suddenly stopped walking, because they're walking around the prison gates. It had already become just a slow stroll, and the administration was getting closer with every step. Let's sit again, Khao, or we'll arrive back too soon, and the friendly but inquisitive prison warder will want to know whether my left knee is getting better or whether blah blah blah. I think I don't know how long you want me to go with this.
That's fine, that's
Is
fine.
that okay?
Yep, thank you very much. Thank you. So we got to, I think, this slide, showing world population by country. And I'd like you to bear some of these slides in mind as I go through the talk. Obviously, America, very high population, and China and India. But growing, although not massive populations at the moment perhaps, but growing populations, thank you, growing populations in Africa too. Am I speaking loud enough?
Okay, for the Skype people, it's difficult.
Am I speaking loudly enough for you in here now? Yeah, so I'm a teacher, I'm not used to using a microphone. Okay. So I'd like to thank Terry for reading that. Thank you very much, Terry. And a couple of his books that relate on the topic of population are The Malthus Pandemic and this one, Prisoners. The Malthus Pandemic is about a high-flying virologist deciding it was time to do something about uncontrolled population growth because, he says, overpopulation is too sensitive a subject for politicians and they won't discuss it. And yet it is the basic cause of most of the world's problems: poverty, environmental destruction, conflict and mass migration. In the story, the virologist teams up with a rogue organisation to spread the designer virus he has created. An extreme action, maybe, but all very feasible. Sorry. In Prisoners, as I said already, it's the year 2050, so I've read that synopsis. Again, this professor, ex-politician, has been gave his views and was basically ostracised from the establishment. And that's not so dissimilar to perhaps some of the views of people who put through, like Harding in 1972, came up with the idea of the lifeboat ethics. And that's the reason for my title to this talk later on. We're familiar with photos like this, possibly from somewhere in South America, that shows what cities might be like. There's not just an environmental, there's going to be a huge social consequence. At the moment in Bangkok, the schools are being closed because the air has been deemed as unhealthy by the government. this graph probably doesn't come, I don't know how clearly you can see that from the back. This just shows you that in the worldwide newspaper coverage from about the mid-90s up until the following decade, the number of climate change articles increased and increased and increased, and the number of events, of extreme weather events, increased slowly but certainly increased as well. Those sort of events and reports in the media, you know, how biodiversity is suffering, how global temperatures are causing local flooding, are very, very common. However, discussing overpopulation is taboo, this person thought from Lancaster College in America, because it threatens to breach the fortified value we've placed on reproductive autonomy. And when I was doing my search, I said I went to Siam Paragon, I couldn't find much. I couldn't find a lot of articles relating to overpopulation and ethics when I was doing my research. A lot of new articles. So I looked at a journal called Population and the Environment, and I thought, that's bound to have something about overpopulation. But interestingly, this goes from 1970, sorry, I can't even see my own graph here, 1978 to 2013. The number of articles peaked in the 90s, and again it's dropped off. It's politically not popular to talk about overpopulation. Sometimes it's called population control, perhaps more, less alarmingly, it's called population stabilization, which doesn't sound quite so threatening, it doesn't sound quite so scary. We've heard of reports in the media very often on the internet about using 1.5 worlds or 2 worlds or 3 or even 4. When I did my masters from London, I was told that we would need four globes if everybody was to live at the level of affluence that this is in the West. And that comes up with the IPACT formula. The IPACT formula. The impact on the environment is due to a combination of population, the size of the population, the affluence, the wealth of that nation, and their use of technology. The more people there are, the more technology they use, the more pollution that causes. Of course, technology depends on whether it's new technology or old technology that's less efficient and more likely to pollute, but there is a technology part in it. As I mentioned, Elizabeth Cripps has a very good argument from the social justice point of view as to why technology alone might be able to help reduce environmental impacts, but the social cost of that means that although very few people benefit from that new technology and the efficient and the expensive technology, that means there's a lack of funding available to ensure social justice globally, because there's only so much money to go around. So really technology alone isn't the answer. Making people live less affluently is although a good idea, it's not necessarily a welcome idea, perhaps possibly impractical. So why is population stabilization needed? Well, for development. I think everybody realizes there's a human rights to develop, for countries to develop. But if we all develop and therefore end up producing as much carbon dioxide and doing as much environmental damage as has been done in the West and in the northern nations already, then that is not sustainable, and we're going to leave something for future generations where they won't be able to live to the standard we think is acceptable. And existential, in this book by Diana Cool, do you want to see this book, Darryl?
Yep,
I don't know if you
It's on.
when you hold it.
it's okay. I can see it.
Okay. Which is called Should We Control World Population? She makes four particular arguments. One that is developmental, one that is existential. In other words, the existence that people are going to have in those cities like that, is it a life worth living? Is it going to be just a mere existence? There's an environmental, and we know about biodiversity loss. We know about habitat destruction by humans. We know about the global warming and the change that has. All largely due, it's not just overhunting, it's about the human impact on the environment, directly and indirectly. There'll be an economic an argument for why the population needs to be stabilised as well, because of the cost to nations. There's also a strong argument for stabilisation, that if people have smaller families, then the nation can improve economically. If people are focused on sharing their wealth over a smaller family unit, that family unit tends to live better. There's more money to go around per child. I'm sorry. So we look at population per country, but if we look at the population density, you've got a slightly different path. And India, very, very high population density, and there's obviously also possibly soon to be the largest population per nation on Earth. China and parts of Africa. As the population increases in Africa, they will become more affluent as well, hopefully, if they develop the way we'd hope for them to develop, and therefore they again will have a bigger impact on the world and the environment. Some policy approaches. There's a coercive approaches where in places like China, where there's a one-child policy, in India, where in the past there were forced sterilizations of women, but also I read up to 1 million men, poor men, who were coerced into it, feeling that it was better for their wider family rather than for them immediately. And there are human rights arguments against that, obviously, and also eco-feminists saying it's an offence against women particularly as a gender issue. There are incentive changing policies that could be hard, as opposed, imposing fines. It's not completely forced, but it helps change people's behaviour through fines or extracting tax benefits, or there could also be soft approaches through education and positive financial incentives. There's also a choice option, rather than being coercive, forcing people on against their will, rather than just giving incentives to change behaviour. Perhaps we can empower people through providing contraception, family planning, more education and employment for women, helping them to make the choice themselves. This last one helps to ensure justice for women, where we're providing education for women, where women can get that updated education, and in a way that they can receive it, then they can make the choice themselves. Many women don't want to have very, very large families. I know that some women, in some cultures, it can be a sign of status, but for many women they realise that if they have more children it's difficult to feed and difficult to provide for the family. But they haven't got access to those facilities as well. So providing family planning clinics and employment helps to empower them. But does it reach teenagers? Young girls, 14 to young women, 25, might not be wanting to go to the same family planning facilities in the same way that adult women who are already married might not be approachable. I'm particularly thinking in less developed countries. Would it be at times when they want to go? Would it be in a style that would be welcoming to them? But where is action needed most? I'm sure that you can't see this graph clearly from where you are, but if I point out to you that the blue at the top is Africa, along the bottom it's got children per woman, and up the side it's got the amount of the population increase, this one's population increase. So we can see very clearly here, although there aren't such big circles, you've got many, many African nations where you've got very high population increase, 3% or more, and you've got a large number of women per children on average. Again, that's from our World in Data website. I was reading this report. Well, this was an address to the Ecological Society in the UK from John Lawton, and he came up with 11 reasons why politics is, 11 reasons, many of which were political, as to why policies are ineffective on environmental issues. Now, some of these apply to the population arguments as well. First of all, he said actually the scientists are slightly to blame because we give mixed messages over climate change. There's no clear consensus, and perhaps the same could be applied to population control, I say. Sometimes there's too much information, and it's difficult to see the wood for the trees in an English expression. Difficult for politicians to make a clear choice. There's so much information. Politicians, he says, like to avoid uncertainty. Like to use uncertainty as a way to avoid difficult decisions, making difficult decisions. They're looking for public approval. Policies consider other issues as well. They have to consider, for example, the cost. And yet, as ethicists or as biologists, people might be more concerned with the science. Ecologists and politicians have very different timescales. We're talking of decades or centuries of thinking, whereas politicians are looking for perhaps the next one term, 3 to 4, 5 years maybe. There are other interest groups to consider. Industry and campaigners, charities. The Right to Life charity might be a very powerful lobby. There are institutional failures of joined up government, meaning that one department might have one policy that actually doesn't work in synchrony with another one. That's antagonistic. And there's a paradox of cooperation at an international level of politics. No one country wants to be the one to introduce a policy in case the others don't, and then they're disadvantaged. Science flies in the face of political wisdom, dogma, or entrenched belief. These are John Lawton's arguments. I respect this guy, and I'm not surprised at the last one. Some politicians are corrupt.
Really?
Really? Thank you. Barriers to education and family planning. Paternalism. In many countries, I think I mentioned some in this particular paper, but in many countries there's a paternalistic way that the country is organised, or the power structure within the country, and that might not encourage certain people to want to go to things that they're taught to. The political environment. The accessibility, the time or the location, and the logistical or the procedure. If you've got lots and lots of paperwork to fill in before you go to a family planning clinic, then it might be very off-putting. You just leave it, especially if you're a teenager or you're not particularly literate. And the social pressures that again affect young people who are perhaps making more emotionally based decisions than analytical. And there's a cost. Going back to the paternalism, this is from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation website. I thought it sums it up quite nicely. When this lady, who was a cleaner, was invited on a training on a family planning in Kenya, she was sure there'd been a mistake. Those things are always for nurses and doctors only. Why would they ever want a sweeper to go into that class? She asked herself. But is this 32-year-old lady who's exactly the sort of person that they're looking for, because she's got a family of 7, and she actually said afterwards, we learned so much about family planning in those classes. And this gets the idea, you know, if you haven't got an education, if you're not somebody of importance in the community, perhaps you just think, I'll think, well, it won't be for me, that's for somebody who's educated, somebody who knows best to decide for me. And that's a really sad state of affairs. So if we can offer family planning, contraception, and ways to empower women to work in education, perhaps that will have a far greater impact on slowing population growth rates. So talking population growth rates, and here they are, much, much higher in Africa than, even though we had these high populations in China and India, the growth rate is still much higher, possibly around about a fertility rate of up to about 4. I say 4 because it's stuck in my mind, 4.0 average children per woman. It's stuck in my mind because here in Thailand, 50 years ago, that was the birth rate. In fact, I think it's slightly higher, 4.2, a fertility rate. And there weren't coercive policies in place, but there has been a number of choice or incentive making. There's been a lot of awareness raising about if you reduce the number of children in your family, you become more affluent. There's been a lot of education about contraceptive use to prevent sexually transmitted diseases. There's been a desire for people to become more affluent and not live like that, not live in abject poverty. And so in Thailand, the fertility rate has dropped. In fact, I think recently there's been considering a policy to encourage people to have more children, because the fertility rate has dropped well below 2. Again, I'm sure from the back, I apologise for the quality of this. This is actually a screenshot. I couldn't manage to get this, to download this one. This says Africa up here, so any of these spots that you can actually see are highlighted. And along the bottom it's contraception prevalence, and up the side is fertility rate. So the contraception prevalence up to 80%, down to 0%. But again, you can see in most countries from this data that there's a gradient, a negative gradient, going as there's more contraception, quite steeply the number of average births comes down. But if you look at the African countries, that isn't quite such a steep gradient. So it shows that even if you increase the amount of contraception available, it doesn't necessarily impact on the number of children per woman. And so it has to be more than just providing contraception, it's much more about empowerment. There is a UN department, UNFPA, and when we go back to the development goals, you can see several of them are particularly important or related to human population growth, but particularly gender equality, good health and well-being, and quality education. So three there, very, very prominent in the minds of family planning policies. The behavioural, a unit in the UK, which is particularly involved in this, came up with this idea from behavioural economics. Make it easy, make it attractive, make it social, and make it timely. This group in Africa shows how they've set up youth clubs to encourage girls to go to youth clubs. They get a reward if they have not had a child after 1 year still being in the youth club. And it's been so successful in its pilot study, they're now saying, well, it's not just girls, it's the boys as well. You know, they're half the 50% of the issue here. So let's do the family planning clinics at the football clubs and reward them for attendance and reward them as well. So making it easy, doing it where they want it, making it attractive by doing it in a way that the young people are interested in. And it's not such a social stigma to go to the clinic and get asked for contraception, making it more acceptable, making it social, making it timely when doing events when the children are available to be there. So I'm going on a little bit, it's been half an hour. East, easy, accessible, social and timely. Football clubs, youth clubs, and that's not my work, that's from these people in Tanzania. Again, so this is for a report talking about using behavioural economics and family planning, and they came up in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, and they came up with the idea of lottery prizes. Guidelines for call operators, so when they call people to say you've got an appointment at the clinic, actually training those call operators made a difference on the response rate, on the uptake rate. Having an automated message on a hotline, a new type of e-voucher, rewarding people for bringing a friend along to the clinic as well. And of course, sending reminders and SMSs and using other new media. So I suggest that perhaps using social media, giving information about family planning clinics and locations and times, telling people about the cost, giving them incentives and saying how popular it's becoming. It was shown in America that if you told people, lots of people, when you phoned up and you're doing canvassing for voting, saying, most people are going voting today, actually, even if that wasn't the case, then more people did go voting that day, just because they thought, well, everybody else is doing it, so will I. Making appointments, invitations, reminders, and simplifying procedures. So as more and more young people have smartphones, there could be an app available and it's not a difficult procedure. But does this cause an invasion of privacy? So I've spoken for over half an hour now, so I'll just mention most of these policies obviously involve reducing birth rates or limiting birth rates, but perhaps in the population debate there's also a chance to revisit euthanasia discussions. There is an argument to say that active and passive assisted suicides, for example, are ethically equivalent. If you can say that you're helping somebody to reduce their suffering, you're actively, it's no worse than leaving somebody to suffer. It has got legal status in a few countries, the Netherlands for one. There are various support groups for this. Dignitas helps Swiss nationals. It's obviously legal in the Netherlands, I think in Belgium maybe, I'm not sure about that. Dignity in Dying in the UK, Exit International, World Federation of Right to Die, and there's societies, there's 38 of those. So perhaps the time to discuss euthanasia or assisted suicide for people who are wishing and able to make a cognizant, their own choice, is up for further discussion. So to sort of sum up, social and political responsibilities that we have, international governance to monitor countries that are doing population stabilisation measures, the need for a legal framework and enforcement. I think that there needs to be more social action, more social responsibility through things like social media. Why can't Facebook and other social media providers also join in this? I think make it sound like everybody else is reducing their family numbers, so perhaps you should too. So going back to the IPAT formula, the impact is a combination of population affluence and technology, but I've said it's also, I think, significantly social and political. So it's socio-political, population, there's a legal aspect to it, it needs to be monitored and enforced. I take as said the affluence and the technology. So perhaps that is ICEPLAT rather than IPAT, or if we say social network information prompts, so when we send reminders, we get SNPs. And to finish, this is from James Lovelock, the Gaia concept. Perhaps the greatest value of the Gaia concept lies in its metaphor of a living earth, which reminds us that we are part of it and that our contract with Gaia is not about human rights alone, but includes human obligations. I'll finish there. Thank you. Would anybody like to ask any questions?
Any questions or comments, please? Yes, Daniel. Come up and use them. Oh, you got a mic there? Good.
Regarding your last sentence, actually, obligations towards Gaia,
So your presentations.
if you could expand on that.
Okay. I was quoting from Professor Lovelock, and he's much more qualified than me to talk about Gaia. But I think we have obligations to leave. If we look at sustainable development definition as leaving the planet in a position to allow future generations to live if we live within our means, so that it leaves the planet available for future generations, to live within their means. That's what I mean, a responsibility for that. We have a responsibility to future generations.
Future generations of humans only, or of living beings in general?
I would say we're living beings who live with living things in general, because I take it as read that we recognise we are so interdependent. If we ignore the plant and the animal and the fungal and the various other kingdoms, if we ignore those, then it's to our own detriment. We can't live off chemicals alone. And who would want to? Thank you.
So I have one more question.
Sure.
About human population, you were actually indicating that the best policy is not coercive, but rather than, could I describe it as democratic in the sense of human freedom?
I would say, certainly not coercive. I've just raised it for debate and said really that an option providing, yes, doesn't go against democracy, but I don't think democracy is necessarily essential to ensure human rights in this area, because I think that democracy necessarily in the West might be different from democracy in a less developed country. It might have different impacts, and as Dr. Mesa has shown already, that in some patriarchal, less democratic societies, there are still evidence of human rights not being abused. And I can't remember which particular article I'm talking about there. Sorry, is that clear? Oh, very.
Yeah, I'm asking because I'm trying to integrate my own thoughts about these issues, and I'm not sure. I believe I ought to rethink democracy. I'm trying to do it recently, because democracy couldn't be every 4 or 5 years elections. So when I'm thinking about it, because that's also in Iran, and they have some form of democracy, but it does not preserve enough human freedom and human rights, and rights in general. So when I was thinking of democracy, I was thinking about, let's say, non-hierarchical decision-making, including regarding population.
I think that my emphasis is that we want to steer completely away from coercive, that abuse of human rights. And there are, in economically developed countries, then incentive-based policies might work better, because people are going to have a financial difference of having more children or not having children, a greater difference. I think what we need to do is to look at how we can help the issue in less developed countries, and providing choice, empowering women to work, providing education, providing facilities, I think is a better way forward that doesn't impinge on human rights. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
I was wondering if you could return to the slide that I had mentioned about the increase in the distribution of population weights in terms of species with the livestock and the wildlife and the human.
I'm not sure why this is not.
I'm just wondering if you're on your computer, if the light on the screen, if you have a button to increase the screen light.
I can't even get the PowerPoint to show again.
No, we don't. So just to, you can talk about the slide.
I can talk about the slide, I can show you it later.
Okay.
Which do you want, one with the pie charts?
I was just wondering, you had that now so much of the population is livestock
Yes,
rather than,
I can show you this.
okay.
Can you see that from where you are?
A bit, and I'll take a look at it later. It's
Okay.
really, it's significant what we've,
It is. These are two slides from Population Matters, but it was based on work by a chap called Smil, I presume you pronounce his name, S-S-M-I-L. It's referenced in, I think it's referenced in my article. And I mean, it is probably just estimates, but I don't think it shows you the scale. I don't think you can take these as actual figures. But it says in 1970, since 1970 to date, which was 2016, it says there, the human population's increased by 85%, whereas the wild vertebrate population has decreased by 58%. In the next one I showed was the weight of vertebrate land mammals, and again 10,000 years ago humans 1%, wild animals 99%. Today humans 32%, wild animals 1%, and livestock 67%. So I presume that means cows, sheep, goats. I'm not sure if it includes fish farming in there.
thank you.
Okay, I presume it includes poultry as well. Any other questions? Good morning. The reason I can't, sorry, just go back there. The reason why I mentioned that, I was quite interested reading in this month's Biologist magazine from the Royal Society of Biology in the UK. There's an interview with a lady who is the head of conservation and biodiversity at London University, one of the London universities. And she didn't even mention human population. I was quite surprised. And I know that omission is meant sort of like no proof is no proof. The fact that we can't observe something, but it just surprised me how little overpopulation is in the mind of policymakers now. Sorry, thank you.
Alex, earlier you mentioned about renewable energy.
Yes.
And that you mentioned, could you kindly elaborate more on that? Because you mentioned that despite of there is renewable energy, the carbon dioxide was not decreased, or you made mention. Could you elaborate more on that?
Yeah. Yes, I was saying that even though there's been, I haven't got data to hand to show the level of economic investment in renewable energy worldwide, but I see more and more wind turbine uptake. The percentage of renewable energy has got a target to be sort of 20 to 30%, depending on which country, by the end of the next decade. There's a huge investment and lots of infrastructure to do that. But so far, carbon dioxide levels don't seem to have decreased. The latest data from last year, they were slightly higher over the 10 years up to the end of last year than they were in the 10 years before that, the decade before that. So although there has been an increased level of renewable energy technology use and development, as yet it hasn't had an impact on carbon dioxide levels. Because we're still using the aeroplanes, we're still using lots of older technology globally.
So you're pertaining on the investment, for the using renewable energy.
Yeah, I wasn't relating it directly to the population, the control policies. I was just saying that we are spending lots and lots on it, but if we don't address the population issues, then more population will be producing more and more pollution as well. So it's not just technological. I take technological improvements as a given. They're going to have to happen, and if they don't happen, we've got a much more tragic choice in the future. Whether it be 2050, as Terry speculates in his novel, or whether it's 100 years or 200 years from now. It was in 1972 was the Club of Rome meeting, is that right?
Yep.
1972, so we're 82, 92, 100, that's what I'm so used to doing this with children. We're about 50 years on, we're about halfway through, but the population level has doubled since that report was made. The average global temperature has increased since we were at that stage. The human impact on the environment has increased. The number of wild animals has decreased. The amount of wild space, it can go on. So if we only look for technological, and I'm sure that affluence has increased in the West as well, and that will be a very, very difficult thing to address on its own, and to deny people in developing countries the opportunity to become more developed and more affluent seems just morally unacceptable to me totally as well. So then that gives a stronger way to, let's not ignore this population issue, but it seems to be at the moment.
I'm very interested with renewable energy because there are 6 sources of renewable energy, and if I abbreviate that, I call that as Big Show. Big Show, BI stands for biomass, G stands for geothermal, S stands for solar, H stands for hydrothermal, O stands for ocean, which I'm very much interested because we are connected to maritime, and W stands for wind. But you are right, no? Like in the Philippines, I wonder why, ocean is a very good source of energy, and we have vast of oceans in the country. But I wonder why it's not being utilized. And you're right, the investment is very, very expensive. But that's why we would like to encourage foreign investors as well, because I believe that with the growth of population, there is a need to really go to renewable energy in order to minimize the cost brought by using gasoline in their energy.
Sure, thank you. There's some data available, I can't quote where, but if we do use renewable energy, then yes, perhaps we are sustainable at this level of population if we all live with the same amount of affluence as the average people in Guyana. So if we want to live more affluently than that, then we have to have much more than just a technological solution. It's not just energy technology, it's also technology in farming, technology in housing, construction, etc. But thank you, the energy, there are huge untapped resources of energy available, like ocean. Yeah, thank you.
May I change a little bit the discussion? I think again we have a very complex issue, and we've been discussing several complex and diverse issues during the last 3 days. And again we have a very huge, very diverse or very complex. I would put some points just to think about. You are talking about controlling the population. Sorry for my poor English, but anyway, I'll try to explain all the things I think about. And we have some countries that are getting old, so they are not going to improve their population. And at the same time, we have some governments that avoid migration that would solve this first problem of getting old population. So, in this sense, do you think we should control, because this you are talking about the at least developing country, at least developed, sorry, but countries that are less than developed countries. So sorry, but those countries, from my understanding, they are also migrating. They have no control, but they are kind of compensate these old countries. So in this sense, should we control the population like your purpose, or because it's linked to the environmental issue, it's a kind of thinking about sustainability itself, and we have several economic issues. So I'm trying to put several things to think about this control, because for me it sounds like not eugenic, but kind of strange to have this kind of control. I don't know if I got well your meaning, but just to clarify a little bit, I'd like you reflect a little bit about those other elements, please.
You say eugenic.
Eugenic, yes.
Eugenic, yeah, sure. Well, I mean, as soon as population control starts being discussed, there is, that fear that it's going to be sort of like Nazis, and I mean, with good reason. I refer in the paper to a film that was out in last year's Global Health Film Festival, a film called Amma, about in North American Native Americans, about how there was forced sterilizations, basically, and that's like nearly eugenic, and that's not what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying is that I called my paper originally Policies to Avoid Lifeboats, and I've now called it Mechanisms. Basically, I've renamed it, but Mechanisms to Avoid the Need for Lifeboats. In 1972, Hardin wrote a book, Hardin of the Tragedy of the Commons, wrote a book basically about the lifeboat policy. If there's 40 people in a lifeboat and only room for 10 more, and there's hundreds of swimmers in the sea, which 10 do you choose? And it was used as an argument in the 70s, well, perhaps we shouldn't give aid to developing countries. I don't know, they were called developing countries in those days, but we shouldn't give aid to countries in need unless they've got population policies, control policies in place. So you're forcing countries to ensure that their population didn't grow, not giving them a choice. And that was slammed as being unacceptable. But it doesn't mean that we need to shy away from the fact that the population is growing, and it is going to make a policy like that even possibly not acceptable, but more politically convenient in the future. If the population did get to 11, 12 billion, then there might not be any democracy present to be able to restrict governments taking that sort of action. And if they did, I don't suppose they'd be choosing, let's all the Down syndrome stay alive, or if you've got this defect, perhaps they'll be very much selecting on what they consider acceptable. Sorry, I've gone off track a little bit. I don't think it should be coercive policies. I think it should be soft incentives. And giving people choices, education, I think, empowerment for women, employment for women, and providing facilities.
Thank you so much. I forgot to include democracy So I would talk kind of 3 or 4 hours about this.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but anyway.
It is a complex issue, as you say. There are so many factors.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Okay, Sarah, last comment, please.
Going off what you just said, you support non-coercive action, but direct. So you would want to label them directly as population control or population stabilization or repossession. Like you would want to label it and market it as that, because there's a big difference between handing out contraceptives and saying this is for you to not have as much kids, and handing out contraceptives and saying this is for you to have choice.
That's why I think education is so important. So I think without educating people about the choice, then they can't make an informed choice. Look at the referendum in Britain over leaving Europe. Sorry, I shouldn't mention that, but people weren't really fully informed of the consequences it would be, and now they can't get to a political agreement. And it might be a democracy, but it's not working. I think if you're giving people access to contraceptives or contraceptive methods, then yeah, you've got to say what are the benefits for them, what are the disadvantages for them, but what other options that will lead to as well.
I think my question is, would you label the initiative as a population control initiative? Or would you label that as an educational, health-related initiative? Because I think ethically it would be quite different based on what you choose to label it.
Right, I'm not sure about how I would label it as such, but I think, so I'm not quite sure where you're coming from on that.
I think I understood you.
Okay, thank you, sorry.
Are there any other comments or questions?
Yeah, Terry.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Terry.
I think the most significant part of your presentation, Alex, was that first slide, where in fact no one's discussing it. This is the problem. You know, there are specifics being talked about around here, but in general, no one talks about it. We hear an awful lot about climate change. Hey, what is the cause of climate change? It's overpopulation. When you drill it right down to the basic cause, it is overpopulation. And overpopulation is also the main cause of the environmental destruction we've looked at, on species loss, on conflict, on economic migration, which could solve your problem of solving your old people thing. That doesn't come in to look after your old people. And it's the problem of food and water shortages, but there is no discussion on it. We've recently had Davos, the great political gathering of the good and the whatever, speaking about the world economy. Not one word was mentioned about overpopulation or population. It's politically incorrect to discuss it, unfortunately. So this seminar really is about ethics. But it's also about political correctness. It's not politically, it's too politically sensitive to talk about overpopulation, so it doesn't get discussed. You know, the political will is not there to discuss it. The political will is not there to discuss the issues that you mentioned just now. And I think until the world leaders accept that the basic problem with the world at the moment is economy, it's all its troubles, is overpopulation, then we'll get nowhere. And that really is my message.
And so the person thank you, Terry, and the person who asked me originally about Professor Lovelock's, do we owe the responsibility to Gaia? And I think that yes, we do owe that responsibility to the future generations, to the Earth. And I think by shying away from it, we are not accepting that responsibility. Do you want one last question?
Yeah, I just wanted to offer that beyond overpopulation, I think you touched on economics. So we've got 1% of the population now, I think about 4 people actually, who have the same economic facility as like 99% of the rest of the population. So what we're dealing with for, actually beyond overpopulation, is economical inequality, where if we gave those people who have the power, or the Davosians, you might say, the ability to decide on population, we have the ability to have energy usage with renewable energy throughout the world. If we have solar power usage, but the problem with those people who are profiting economically through oil, through exploitation, through destruction of the environment, are the people who have economic superiority. So I think beyond overpopulation, why are the migration of humans, the lack of education in so many of the developing countries? I think economics and greed and the lack of ethics are a much more significant contributor to the problem than actual overpopulation.
Overpopulation itself is a factor. Whether it's more of part, I don't know. Having said that, since the growing population is in Africa, then there will also be growing. They will aspire to affluence, and some of them will be in that possible top 1%. So they will also magnify the problems. So I think it is important. I'm not saying it's most important, but I think the fact that it's not discussed at the moment, we are hiding away from our responsibility. It needs to be addressed. Also.
Okay.
Yeah.
People love each other, people make sex, if people have just kids, so that's the problem.
And
The love.
And also,
Just kidding.
And also, I think it depends on the country. Some countries are, they have their policy regarding a population, but some countries are really overpopulated, like China, India, and the Philippines. So,
China's
an
done it.
equal distribution of goods and products and services. That's also one. And number one is, that's why we need bioethics.
And that's why we need joined up thinking in governments
Yes.
too, and
The
monitoring.
support of the government.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all your comments.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much.